Thank you very much, Barbara, for those very kind words of introduction. And it's amazing what one can find nowadays on the web about a person and their childhood. But it is very much true. And in fact, I have always loved history from as long as I can remember. And listening to Barbara describe the incredible things that PSU Friends of History do for the university and for the broader Portland community is simply remarkable. And I think it's for me, it's simply an honor to have been asked to come here this evening to deliver this lecture and to have the opportunity to participate in what is clearly has been the longue durée of a very important group of people working to bring history not just to students here at the university, but to the broader community. And I think that's something that's very important and in many ways something that I believe in quite deeply as an Africanist. But what I'd like to do tonight is talk to you a bit about some of the details that are in my current book, but also draw connections to the contemporary issues that are raised by my findings, because I think in many ways the kind of research that I do, and some other historians as well, forces us out of our ivory tower, and the research has profound implications on contemporary events, and I will come to that as the lecture goes on. But I'd like to start with a little bit of a story. On an unusually cool Nairobi fall evening, in 1963, a young British colonial officer, who I shall call John because he would prefer to remain anonymous, John was busy gathering piles of documents from the Ministry of Internal Security and Defense. All of the documents he was collecting pertained to the detention camps that the British colonial government had set up all over Kenya during the 1950s as a way of suppressing the Mau Mau insurgents. Files with labels like Manyani Camp and Atrocities, Detainee Works Projects, were all being prepared. Prepared for what? I asked John in a recent interview. Prepared for the bonfires, he casually responded. You see, he said, we had orders from on high to burn all the documents that had anything to do with the detention camps and interrogation centers, and that's what we did. We burned them. And there was indeed plenty of reason to cleanse the historical record of the detention camps and interrogation centers that were scattered all over Kenya in the 1950s. And as I came to learn during my own research some 50 years later, these were sites of unimaginable crimes. British colonial officials and their underlings perpetrated gross human rights violations and then took deliberate steps to cover them up on the eve of decolonization from Kenya in 1963. And, as an historian, looking at this, I spent nearly 10 years trying to piece this story back together again. And as we all know, even the best of purges leave something behind. So what that means is you go to the official archives in places like London and Nairobi, and you painstakingly go through file after file after file, looking for anything you can possibly find. Then you go through private archives and missionary archives, newspapers and photographs, and you conduct interviews. I conducted interviews with former British colonial officers, settlers, missionaries, and hundreds of survivors, men and women, who survived the detention camps of late colonial Kenya. Now, I came to find out several things in the course of my work, one of which was that my premise to begin with was completely wrong. I started out thinking I was going to write a book about the success of British liberal reform in the detention camps of Kenya. You laugh. I stood in front of my G3 conference as a graduate student saying that exact thing, and I was given lots of applause by my faculty members. Well, in part, the files are seductive, because not only were they purged, but what was left behind was a very seductive story about something called rehabilitation or hearts and minds. Well, I came to find out that these camps weren't about hearts and minds at all, but that, in fact, they formed something collectively which I have called Britain's Gulag. There was also something else that really struck me about all of this, and that was the actual numbers of detainees in the camps. Official files say 70 to 80,000 detainees, but time and again, the numbers that kept cropping up in the files that remained suggested something more. And when you look closely at these numbers, what you come to find out was that these were net figures and not gross figures. In other words, they didn't tell you how many detainees came into the camps and how many left. So once you go back through the files and start piecing together the intake and release rates, what you come to find out is that really 2 to 4 times the number of detainees were in these camps, or somewhere as high as 320,000 detainees. But bear in mind that these camps were by and large for men only. But that also raises an issue, because again, in the files, the women were purported to be more steadfastly Mau Mau than the men. But what you come to find out is that the women and the children and the elderly were also detained, but not in the camps, but in the emergency villages. Because dotting the Kikuyu countryside, by the middle of 1954 and 1955, the British colonial government set up 800 emergency barbed wire villages. These villages, surrounded by barbed wire and spiked trenches, under 24-hour guard, women are forced to labor from sunup to sundown. They're tortured, beaten, murdered. These were detention camps in all but name. So once you find out, and you add the numbers detained in the villages to those, the adjusted figures of 320,000, you find out that it wasn't 70 to 80,000 in these camps. You find out that, in fact, the British colonial government detained nearly the entire Kikuyu population of 1.5 million people. The other issue becomes the death figures. Again, the reports suggest that in total, 32 settlers died during the entire Mau Mau emergency. And based upon research, there's no reason to suspect that this number is incorrect, because as we know, the British likely would have padded that number if they could have. Similarly, approximately 11,000 loyalists. These are Africans who are loyal to the British government. I'll talk about them a bit more later. About 1,100 died. And then they suggest that 11,000 Mau Mau adherents died. Now, again, if we look at the extensive empirical evidence from countless eyewitnesses, testimonies from Asian attorneys, many of these men who represented the Africans who went off to the camps, one of whom a man by the name of Fitz D'Souza, who said tens of thousands of them simply never came back. This was a kind of ethnic cleansing. When asked, several of these attorneys estimated the numbers to be in the hundreds of thousands. And also what's compelling are the demographic figures, because what we find out is that the Kikuyu were not growing at the same rate as the other ethnic groups surrounding them, the Kamba, the Luo, and the Luya. And if you apply the growth rates of the surrounding ethnic groups to the Kikuyu figures, what you find out is that we're missing somewhere between 150 and 300,000 Kikuyu. Now, to give you a sense of the nature of the war crimes that took place in Kenya during the 1950s, I'd like to introduce you to a few of the other people who I interviewed during the course of my research. The first is a man by the name of Pascasio Macharia, who lives in Murang'a district in Kikuyu Central Province. And he described to me his experiences in Manyani detention camp, which was one of the largest camps in Kenya, and what was happening in the compound across from his. And he could see this compound because they're separated simply by barbed wire. And it was something that he described in his words as completely unimaginable. And he went on to say, one day the Askaris, that is the guards, brought in a group of black or hardcore detainees, which included Chief Peterson and his headman, Gathumbi. You see, the chief and his headmen had actually sided with Mau Mau, and from what we could tell, they had been discovered by the authorities, and they were now in the camps with the rest of us. When they were brought to Compound 6, that was where I saw the worst kind of sadistic punishment being meted out to detainees. Something happened in that compound that I had never seen before, and which I shall forever remember. When the whole group of detainees was herded inside, they were told to remove all of their clothes and leave them in the corner of the compound. Then the Askaris set on them, beating them indiscriminately with clubs and mattock handles, chasing them around the compound. Those people were beaten and chased so badly, we kept saying to each other, that they would only survive through a miracle. Then Peterson, who was a fat man because he had formerly been a chief, became so dark in his complexion we thought he was going to die. But then the Askaris brought in fire buckets full of water, and the detainees were called in one by one, Peterson first. The Askaris then put his head in the bucket of water and lifted his legs high in the air, so he was upside down. And that's when Wakathandia, who was the painfully ugly guard from Tanganyika, started cramming sand in Peterson's anus and stuffed it in with a stick. Then the other Askaris would put in water and then more sand, and Wakathandia kept cramming it in with a stick. They kept doing this back and forth, alternating between the sand and the water, occasionally lifting Peterson so he could breathe. Mapiga, the Mzungu, or the European or British officer in charge of the camp, was standing there the whole time, ordering them to keep shoving in the water and sand and stick in his anus. Eventually, they finished with Peterson and carried him off, only to start with the next detainee in the compound. Then there was a woman by the name of Salome Maina, who I met in the area of Thigiu, which is down in southern Kiambu, just outside of Nairobi. And it was there some 50 years ago that Salome, along with another woman and two young men, were picked up by British soldiers and taken to a nearby home guard post, which was a kind of interrogation post. And in Salome's words, she says, the white officer in charge made the two young men strip naked and then commenced to beat them mercilessly. Then he came and started kicking me with his boots all over my body. The other lady was said to be the one who used to accommodate gangs in her home. He would hold us by our necks and bang our heads together. Then we were beaten until we fell unconscious. When I awoke, I saw the two young men were beaten so badly until blood was coming down their faces and bodies. But we could still hear them pleading with those who were beating us. When they still couldn't get information from me, they decided to put paprika pepper inside my private parts. We were ordered to lie down on the open area inside the Ruthagiti home guard post. No one held us down, but guards stood over us with guns. We were ordered to separate our legs with our knees raised. Failure to comply invited ruthless beating. Then a bottle full of a mixture of pepper and water was inserted into my birth canal and the contents emptied inside me. As the bottle was being emptied, it was held in place with the heel of a booted foot. After the pepper was inside of me, it's impossible for anyone to imagine the torment. The burning could be felt everywhere, in the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and all over. It happened that the previous day, the day we were arrested, a lady named Watiri had been given the same treatment. Only hers had been made from pepper and petrol. It was fortunate that the vehicle had left by the time my mixture was being prepared. After this, I was later carried to where Watiri was still lying, groaning, in agony and vomiting. And then Salome goes on to describe that Watiri dies a few hours later. Now, finally, I'd like to introduce you to a man who was a settler in Kenya during the time of the emergency and who fought for the British in the local volunteer regiment called the Kenya Regiment. And he still lives in Kenya today on an absolutely glorious estate near the shores of Lake Naivasha out in the Rift Valley. And it was there, at his home, that I interviewed him on the condition of anonymity. And as we sat there, drinking gin and tonics around 5 o'clock and being served by his African houseboy, he told me, among other things, about how he and his partners used to interrogate prisoners. And he was talking to me about a particular place called the Mau Mau Investigation Center. And he said this. He said, this Mau Mau Investigation Center is where we liked to send the worst gang members when we captured them in the forest. We knew the slow method of torture there was worse than anything we could do. Special branch had a way of slowly electrocuting a kook. They'd rough one up for days. Once I went personally to drop off one gang member who needed some special treatment. I stayed for a few hours to help the boys out you know, softening him up. Things got a little out of hand. By the time I cut his balls off, he had no ears, and his eyeball, the right one I think, was hanging out of its socket. Too bad. He died before we got much out of him. And of course, I'm sitting there with him and now realizing that nobody knows that I'm there interviewing this man at Lake Naivasha, and he's getting creepier and creepier by the moment, and seems to be enjoying reliving the good old days. But the question then becomes, how do we start to make sense of all of this? And I think, as an historian, I think what we need to do is take a step back, just briefly. I know we have some Kenyans in the crowd, so please excuse my reductionism. You can berate me when it's all over. But what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of background of Kenyan history, because I think in order to understand how we get to this kind of violence and how we start talking about present-day reconciliation, we need to know where we've come from. Because in many ways, the history of Kenya is not unlike the history of many other African colonies during the 20th century, because it centers largely on two issues. And those are the issues of land and labor. And in the case of Kenya, these are exacerbated considerably by the presence of white settlers. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, the British colonial government decided that the basis of the political economy in Kenya was going to be on settler production. And this was made possible through the concerted policy of land alienation. In other words, through shaky alliances and treaties, land was going to be given outright to the white settlers. And the ethnic group, I would suggest, that was most impacted by this was the Kikuyu. And if you look at this map, the area in the middle that's in the dark area, shaded, is the area in which the Kikuyu would come to live. And obviously, the loss of land was devastating, an economic loss. But there's also a social loss to this, because landlessness was just simply anathema to being Kikuyu. To be a man or to be a woman, to move from childhood to adulthood, you had to have access to land. And therefore, it's not surprising that from the very start, the Kikuyu complained bitterly and often about the loss of stolen land. Now, from the very start, the colonial government is exceedingly interventionist. The settlers are miserable farmers when they show up on the scene. Many of them have very little experience. And the one factor that they could consistently squeeze in the economic equation once land was alienated was the labor factor. And if you look at where the Kikuyu live, they are living in very close proximity to the European estates, which means they are going to be the chief labor source on these European tea and coffee plantations. And how do you force these people into the wage economy? One of the first things you do is you put them, as you see here, in a reserve. You confine the area in which they're living, and you make the land impossible to sustain the local population. And then you tax them. You tax everything. You tax doors and huts and houses and dogs and wives and everything else to force them into the wage economy to pay these taxes. And that's exactly what happens. And in Kenya, in fact, they even go one extra measure by introducing a host of master and servants ordinances, which makes it an illegal criminal act to break a labor contract, which meant that if you, as a Kikuyu, broke your labor contract, you could be jailed and fined and publicly flogged. And this happened quite often. And one key factor, and we're going to come back to this a bit later, is that British colonial officials didn't do this alone. They were very much dependent upon, for lack of better words, please excuse me, but collaborators. Local Africans who could assist them in facilitating the colonial political economy. In the case of the Kikuyu, they were a chiefless society. It was stateless. It was governed by a set of councils. So when the British came in, they looked around, they said, who's the chief? And if you were smart, you raised your hand, because if you did, you were given all sorts of rewards in return for forcing people into the labor market. Now, despite all of this, again, the settlers aren't terribly productive. And what happens is we have a great number of Kikuyu who become sharecroppers on the European estates. We call them squatters in Kenyan history, basic sharecropping, not unlike what we see going on in the US South. But World War II comes along, and for the first time, the colonial political economy is profitable with the wartime boom. And what this meant was two things. Number one, we see the squatter option being eroded. They no longer need the sharecroppers because they can start mechanizing these farms. And they start sending these sharecroppers back to the already overcrowded Kikuyu reserves. So if people were complaining about the loss of stolen land before, they're particularly aggravated after World War II. Secondly, we see a huge number of Africans returning from the wartime front. Many, many Africans were conscripted into the army during World War II and fought in places like Burma and North Africa. And they come back to Kenya thinking that they're going to see an improvement in their condition. And what they come to find out is not only is their condition not getting any better, but it's getting worse. So my point is that by the time it entered the post-World War II period, the British colonial government in Kenya had already taken a very long walk down the road of totalitarianism and destructiveness in the colony. And there was a regularization of violence in Kenya, as in, I would argue, all settler colonies in Africa. That was part and parcel of the apparatus of colonial rule. And throughout the continent, there was no informal moral rights accorded to Africans, as, according to many colonizers, because these Africans were not yet fully human, and certainly not worthy of being accorded the rights and benefits that were being bestowed upon the world's international citizenry in the aftermath of World War II. Such rights, of course, being spelled out in things like, as you probably know, the Geneva Conventions, the European Declaration of Human Rights, and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And therefore, it's within this context that we have to place the eruption of mass violence in Kenya after World War II. If we don't see it within this long process, then all of this seems to come out of nowhere. But if we look at the history of colonialism up until the period of World War II as something that is inherently coercive and exploitative and violent, then something like Mau Mau and the British colonial response to it and the war crimes that they commit make much more sense. Now, certainly, the Africans weren't taking all this lying down, right? By the 1920s, they had already formulated in Kenya, as we see happening all over the continent, various political organizations. But these are, by and large, pretty moderate. They're petitioning the British government. They're sending petitions to the governor, and they're sending petitions back to London. And then the post-World War II period comes along, and prominent members of these nationalist organizations are continuing to follow the same line of political activism. And in Kenya, you see people like Jomo Kenyatta and the Kenya African Union. And we're going to talk more about Kenyatta, but Kenyatta, by and large, is a moderate, and he's following this moderate path. But as I mentioned, there's more and more disturbance at the grassroots level. And we see, by the 1940s, in the area in the Rift Valley where these squatters are being forcibly removed from their land, a movement arising. And this movement is arising, and people are taking an oath. And amongst the Kikuyu, oath-taking is a traditional practice. It's a way of forging unity. But this oath-taking practice changes for the changing political circumstances, and suddenly they're pledging themselves to Ithaka na Wiadi, land and freedom. And they're willing to use violent means to achieve these goals. So for example, one oath could be something like, I pledge myself to kick all Europeans out of this colony. If I don't, may this oath kill me. And at the end of every oath, they would say, if I divulge the secrets of this oath, may this oath kill me. In other words, there was very much a strong sense that the supernatural was at work here, and that Ngai, or the creator god, the Kikuyu, would strike down a person should he or she reveal the contents of the oath. Now, British colonial government eventually catches wind that this is going on, and needless to say, they're none too pleased about it. And by 1950, they ban what they call, the British call, Mau Mau. And by 1952, despite the banning of the organization, the oathing is spreading like wildfire. The movement is pervasive throughout the Kikuyu population. And when the new governor comes in, Sir Evelyn Baring, in October '52, he comes to find that there's increasing violence, there are attacks against settlers, cattle are being hamstrung, and he declares a state of emergency. Now, This may sound all too familiar to everybody in the room, but Mau Mau is expected to be a 3-month war. We'd be in there, and we'd be out. Now, I'm sorry, sometimes I just can't help myself. Now, they thought this because they detained 180 of the critical leaders, or the supposed critical leaders of the movement, including its mastermind, Jomo Kenyatta. And the idea was that this acephalous movement would collapse into some kind of terminal frenzy, that the vast majority of the Africans were simply misguided, they were under the spell of Kenyatta, and that they really didn't believe in the tenets of Mau Mau to begin with. Now, of course, a much different story plays out. Approximately 20,000 Mau Mau insurgents flee to the forests in the Aberdares, which are basically to the west of the Kikuyu reserves, and Mount Kenya, which is more or less at the tip in the north. And it takes the British military nearly 2 years to gain the initiative over the movement. But what's more important for our story is that the British colonial government estimated that 90% of the 1.5 million Kikuyu had taken at least one Mau Mau oath. And there were in fact 7 oaths in total. And Kenya, and for those of you familiar with British colonial history, Kenya, unlike Malaya, where there was also a state of emergency going on, there was never martial law in Kenya. Now what that meant was that in somewhere like Malaya, General Templar, who was in charge, was responsible for both the military war and the civilian side of the war. In Kenya, this didn't happen. In Kenya, first it was General Erskine and then General Lathbury were responsible for the forest war, the Mau Mau insurgents, the 20,000 guerrilla. But the 90% of the 1.5 million Kikuyu who had taken an oath and who were refusing to cooperate, that was the responsibility of Governor Bering and the Colonial Office. They had to find a way of somehow or another breaking their Mau Mau allegiance and reorienting them towards colonial control. Now, as I look around the room, I know that some of you remember Mau Mau. I'm sorry. I'm saying, Mimi. Samahani. But Mau Mau became almost instantly synonymous with black, savage evil. Today, if you mention the word Mau Mau, particularly if I'm in Britain, to anybody for that matter there, but if in the US, talking to people who lived through this period, they almost universally recoil. Oh, horrible, savage, most horrible, bestial thing that's ever happened. Now, in some ways, this is a testament to the success of the British colonial government's ability to manipulate information coming out of Kenya. There was a powerful public relations machine that was absolutely masterful. And I think if you respect the British for anything, it's their ability to manipulate and spin information. And images like this is a picture of one of the 32 settlers who were killed. And this young boy in particular had specific meaning. This is 5-year-old Michael Ruck. And he was murdered by his trusted, loyal servants, one of whom just days prior to his murder had tenderly carried him up from a river where he had fallen off of his pony. And this image is beamed all over the world. If you open up magazines from the period, Time, Life, and others, you will see this. And press handouts went out every single day, at least once, if not twice, describing the nature and bestiality of Mau Mau. But it's important to take this image, and I would certainly argue fear, and place it within its context. Because most settlers immigrated to Kenya with the intention of remaining there for their entire lives. They were establishing farms and schools and communities, not just for themselves, but for their children and for their grandchildren. And we get posters like this from the Kenyan Electors Union. No more jinking. For those who speak British speak out there, I think that's no more kidding. We're here to stay. And images like this, settler women spending their afternoons after tea having target practice. Now, in the settlers' imagination, the Kikuyu, who are now Mau Mau, were scarcely part of humanity. And from the early days, this belief became accepted orthodoxy, not just amongst the settlers, but within the local circles of the colonial administration. Bear in mind, these were very young men, civil servants who were out there socializing and intermarrying with the local settler population. And there emerged a dehumanizing discourse about Mau Mau that was startling. Mau Mau, and I quote from various sources from the time, were filthy animals, vermin, scum, barbarians, atavistic pigs, cunning, bloodthirsty, and mix, short for Mickey Mouse. It's supposed to be pejorative, I suppose. In other words, in the words of one former colonial district officer, he said this: "All we heard was how savage Mau Mau was, shoot to kill. You can't imagine how often I heard, the only good kook is a dead kook." There was this idea that Mau Mau was savage, just completely atavistic, and somehow had to be gotten rid of, regardless of how it was done. The idea was everywhere. Now, I would argue that this eliminationist discourse was predominant throughout the colony. And the logic, as with the logic of any looming genocide, is all too easy to follow. Mau Mau adherents did not belong to the human race. They were diseased, filthy animals who could infect the rest of the colony. Their very presence threatened to destroy Kenya. They had to be eliminated. The question then becomes, how does this eliminationist mentality translate into killing on the ground? And I think here we need to look at a couple of different factors. First of all, what was the grand plan or design of the governor and the colonial secretary, the two men in charge of this civilian war? And here the evidence points to the fact that in the fall of 1952, when this emergency starts, Governor Bering and Colonial Secretary Littleton were committed to regaining control of Kenya and to maintaining British rule in the colony. And even the most liberal mind in the colonial office at that time was writing about the fact that Kenya would be part of the British Empire for at least another generation, perhaps more. Second question becomes, who were the governor's foot soldiers on the ground? Who were the people who were to man these detention camps as camp commandants? Who were to direct operations over these villages that were detention camps in all but name? Well, in fact, the same people who were perpetuating this eliminationist mentality, the settlers and the young district officers, are put in charge. Because, bear in mind, unlike Malaya, Kenya is not suffering a communist attack. Mau Mau is not communist. And therefore, the suppression of the insurgency has to be supported entirely by the financial coffers of the Kenya government, not by London. And what that meant was this was counterinsurgency on the cheap. So the governor, as the detention camp system explodes, has little choice but to take these same people who are calling for the wiping out, the elimination of the entire Kikuyu population, suddenly puts them within a situation whereby they have the means to carry out their beliefs. The third factor, and which I alluded to before, are the Kikuyu loyalists, who during the war are known as the Home Guards. And loyalism had a very specific meaning in Kenya during the Mau Mau War. To be a loyalist, you had to actively fight on the side of the British colonial government. You had to be willing to kill your neighbor, and you had to be able to prove that to those who were in charge. And if you were willing to do that, you would be rewarded handsomely with things like additional land, preferred access to trading licenses, restriction movements were raised, and you were allowed to travel in and out of Nairobi. My approach then is based on the assumption that Governor Bering and Littleton, and later Littleton's successor, Allen Lennox Boyd, had a single driving intention. They were committed not just to maintaining British colonial rule in Kenya, but to manipulating the colony's political trajectory, particularly in relationship to future African leadership. But it's also based on the assumption that none of these men set out with the intent of annihilating the Kikuyu population. There is nothing in the colonial record to suggest that there was Kenya's version or Britain's version of an Adolf Hitler. But it's my argument that these two intentions, maintaining colonial rule and preventing a massacre of the Kikuyu oath takers, the Mau Mau supporters, were mutually exclusive in principle and nearly impossible to uphold under the realities and constraints of late colonial Kenya. And what we see happening is that from the very start, the British colonial government, Baring and the colonial secretary, are forced to create an incredibly restrictive police state. By 1953, they had introduced dozens of emergency regulations, laws ranging from enforcing communal punishment and curfews to individual mass movements of people, confiscation of property, imposition of special taxes, suspension of due process, detention without trial. The list goes on and on and on. But this doesn't work. And if you think about it quite logically, the only option that they had at this point was to do one of two things: pull out or round up the entire Kikuyu population, detain them, and force them somehow to submit to colonial authority. Now, if we take a look at the civilian side of the war, the first thing that the British government does is it rounds up all of the remaining squatters living in the Rift Valley, about 150,000 of them, and ships them back to Central Province, to the same reserves that are already overcrowded. And in the process of this, they start screening people. And screening is the local word for interrogation. And here we see what would be a typical scene of Africans standing outside of a police station. And I had one police officer describe to me quite in detail the sorts of things that they would do, from tying them on to the back of Land Rovers when they would drive off and have them die in various bits and pieces along the road, and the more humane way of simply executing them. Now, with the screening, we see an increase in the detention camp population, but the detention camp population in Kenya explodes in April of 1954, when there is a purging, a complete sweep of Nairobi. Police vehicles go through the streets with loudspeakers, blaring out that all Africans are to exit their homes peacefully, to pack one bag, and to make no problems. Instead, we get images like this of complete chaos. Those who are coming out of their homes are taken in front of large screening parades, where loyalists are shrouded in gakunia, as you know, robes, covering them to protect their identity. And these loyalists would stand in front of these long screening parades and point one way to the camps and the other way back to the reserves. And of course, when I interviewed people, they couldn't quite understand why they had the robes on, because they said, didn't they know that we knew who they were based upon what shoes they were wearing? Because it was actually highly unusual for people to have shoes. The next thing that would happen if you were pointing in the direction of the camps is you'd be packed into one of the screened-in lorries and shipped off to this place, Langata Camp, outside of Nairobi, where you were screened some more. From there, you were sent down, for those of you familiar with Kenya, towards the coast, which would be the present-day area around Tsavo, where there are, did you all see the terrible Val Kilmer movie with the man-eating lions? Anyway, that's where the camps were. And what's interesting about this photograph is that in the foreground we see shoes and snuff containers and pocket watches, which are all initially confiscated by the guards. The detainees are then stripped down, completely naked, cavity searched, and then marched through a cattle dip full of disinfectant, where many of them either drowned because they couldn't swim and the cattle dip was too deep, or they were held under by the guards who were standing there. And then finally, they are assigned a number, and that number would be their identification for the remaining time in the camps. And what's interesting about this, and the reason I have it, is that this was actually made by a detainee from the iron corrugated roofs of one of the camps, because he said if he was going to be forced to wear a number, he was going to make the bracelet himself, and in fact still wears this bracelet today to remind him of these times. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you in the back on this. What's significant about this is that the detention camp system is known as the pipeline. And by the pipeline, they meant that detainees would be moved around these camps. There are about 100 in all. Camps of increasing and decreasing severity, depending upon a detainee's level of cooperation. So in other words, a detainee could be moved around to as many as 8, 10, 12 different camps during the entire time that they were staying within the pipeline. And these camps had a very definite logic to them. But what's interesting as well about the research on this is that there is not a single document left telling you the name of all the camps, where they were located, or their function within the pipeline. And the importance of figuring this out is manifold, not the least of which is when you interview detainees and you ask them about their camp sequencing, if they give you something that's completely illogical, you know either they're misremembering or frankly they're simply making it up. Now, these camps were very much works camps. Detainees were being forced to labor. And this is an irrigation furrow, you can tell, quite hard labor. And also for those of you who have ever gone to Kenya and you've flown to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, that tarmac was built by detainee labor in the 1950s. Now, of course, the British knew at the time they're in violation of all sorts of international accords, right? Detention without trial is a violation of human rights accords, and like what's going on presently, you can actually get around some of these through loopholes within the agreements. But under no circumstance can you ever torture, and under no circumstance can you ever force detainees who are detained without trial to labor. And in fact, in many of the documents, the Colonial Secretary himself refers to these men as Britain's slave labor pool. Now, the British had to justify what they were doing, and they justified this by saying that they're in fact rehabilitating these men. That these aren't in fact works camps. Yes, we know there's some occasional one-offs, as they called them then. Today we call them bad apples. But that in fact, the argument would always be, listen, a couple of terrible things might have happened, but remember, Mau Mau is the most horrible, bestial, savage thing that's ever happened, and we're doing a good thing. We're rehabilitating them. Now, the reality, of course, is that this is not a site of rehabilitation, but instead what happens within the camps is that the British focus on the oath. There's this belief that the oath, somehow or another, has cast a spell over the Mau Mau detainees. And if one breaks the oath, then you can break the spell of Mau Mau, and you can then introduce these men and women back to the civilized world. Now, ostensibly, detainees would confess because of the carrot of rehabilitation. But in fact, of course, not surprisingly, it was the stick of hard labor and torture. But of course, it needs to be borne in mind, if you follow the logic of this, that detainees always had a way out, right? You could confess your oath and get out of the camps. By kowtowing to the British colonial government, you could save yourself. But many detainees spent years refusing to confess under the pains of unbelievable torture and hard labor. Because clearly there was the belief that they wanted to survive, but they wanted to survive on their own terms. But eventually, of course, they all either confess or they die within the camps. And once they're released from the camps, they're released back into what I described before, the emergency villages. And to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, in the foreground, we have the emergency huts that are packed in side by side. Bear in mind that Kikuyu typically lived in scattered homesteads around the hillsides. They did not live in villages. This was very unusual for the Kikuyu. And up on the side of the ridge is where some of the home guards were living and their families. Here is the watchtower and the home guard post that looks over the emergency village. The incident that I was describing in the beginning was Salo Maina. The home guard post at Ruthagiti would have looked very similar to this on the inside. And here we have the home guard with his silver armband, as well as being surrounded by spiked trenches there, as you can see. And what's interesting about so many of the stories of the survivors about this period of time is that, like Salome, they remember the torture and the murder, but the one thing that stands out in their mind the most is the famine and the disease. And the numbers that died from famine and disease were quite spectacular and were very well recorded, in fact, by many of the local missionaries. The question becomes then, Who knew what in the 1950s, and what exactly did knowing mean? Now, in one of those wonderful moments, for all of you historians sitting in the room, I had in the Kenya National Archives, was coming across two enormous files stuffed filled with letters written by detainees at the time in the 1950s and smuggled out of the camps. And they were smuggled out and delivered to people like the governor, the colonial secretary, commissioner of prisons. And in these letters, they described in painstaking detail the deprivations, the torture, the murder, the hard labor, the conditions in the camps. And here, to give you an example, they're asking that we do not want him, meaning the supplier of meat, to supply us with heads and feet and stomachs of cattle, nor do we want the feet, heads, and stomachs of pigs. We want meat itself. And they go on to talk about the bad diseases. And here in the middle, you see in bold, castration of men, meaning castration of men. Castration was quite widespread in the camps. And it says, where does castration of men come from? Is that the Democrat law? Other people received these letters, including this woman, Barbara Castle, who was a Labor MP during the time. And Barbara Castle was absolutely persistent throughout this entire period about demanding an independent investigation in Kenya. She, in fact, herself went out there to have a look, to see what was going on. And she, day after day in the House of Common Floors, was at the heels, particularly of Colonial Secretary Littleton, and frankly got very little out of him, although except for the fact that, as I spoke with her biographer, she felt as though at least someday she would be vindicated for all that she was doing. And I think in many ways what we see coming out now from the colonial record very much supports Castle's claims. And of course she was very much readily dismissed at the time, in part because she was a political lightweight and seen as an opportunist. And many believe that she was blowing the situation out of proportion as a kind of political meal ticket. There were also others, colonial officials who broke ranks and who gave details. Of course, bear in mind that all colonial officials had to sign the Official Secrets Act, but some did break ranks and gave details about what was going on in the camps. A woman, in this case by the name of Eileen Fletcher, who was a rehabilitation officer, who offered up many examples of what was happening, along with some of her other comrades there. And finally, Punch magazine, for those of you familiar with it, this is a political cartoon, and it's Liberty burning, and you have the burning villages in the background and various body parts and armor in the foreground. But getting back to the British colonial government, I mentioned before, one has to appreciate their masterful spin on Mau Mau, and I think one also has to appreciate their masterful political maneuverings when they were able consistently to avoid an independent investigation. And the calls were repeated on the House of Common Floors. At one point, the Labour Party signs a petition with 193 members, which was practically the entire MP body, demanding an independent investigation into the camps of Kenya. And it's clear that within the existing colonial files today that the British colonial government knew it was in violation of international accords, knew the extent of what was going on in Kenya, and quite frankly were hoping that if they kept their head buried long enough that this would all go away and they would all be out of there. But of course, in March of 1959, something occurs that's called the Hola Massacre. It's called the Hola Massacre because 11 detainees were beaten to death at a detention camp in a place called Hola, which is up near the coast of Kenya, near Lamu. And what was unusual about this was not so much that they were beaten to death, but that the British got caught red-handed. And initially they said that the 11 detainees died from drinking contaminated water, but in fact the coroner slipped out his report, and it turned out that they had all died from blunt force trauma from the beating by guards and white officers. And it's at this point that the British decide to rapidly decolonize and get out. And that's exactly what we see happening. Hola happens in March of '59. Just a few months prior to that, the Colonial Office is talking about another generation or more in Kenya. By 1963, they're out of the colony. And once they leave, for the most part, the whole 8 years of the state of emergency in Kenya is swept under the rug. And of course, this is helped along by the massive document destruction that I opened with at the start of my talk that occurs on the eve of decolonization. But this is not the end of the story, because it has to be pointed out that the independent regimes of Kenya were equally as complicit in silencing the Mau Mau past and the war crimes perpetrated in the detention camps and villages. Because when Jomo Kenyatta came out of detention in 1961, he declared that everyone must forgive and forget the past. They're never to speak about it again. Now, we see a couple things going on here. First of all, as I initially described to you, Kenyatta was never the mastermind, the leader to darkness and death, as he was called by Governor Patrick Renison. Instead, he was a moderate. And he denounced Mau Mau, calling them hooligans. Because Kenyatta didn't want to get rid of the system, he simply wanted to be a part of it. But also, I think, one has to think about the fact that what alternative did he have? Mau Mau was much, by the end, a civil war as it was an anti-colonial war. And there was certainly grave concern on the part of Kenyatta that his independent nation would be consumed by a civil backlash, by the Mau Mau adherents rising up against the former loyalists. And there's another issue at hand. In this newly independent nation that's creating a nationalist narrative, a unifying narrative about the past, if Mau Mau, which certainly did, as we've discussed, accelerate the process of independence, and if Mau Mau was predominantly Kikuyu, what does it say about the rest of the ethnic groups in Kenya? Suddenly, the history of Mau Mau is replaced with "we all fought for freedom." And "we all fought for freedom" becomes the catchword or the slogan for Kenyatta. Because if we all fought for freedom, then we, meaning all the ethnic groups of Kenya, can share in the fruits of independence. Later, when Kenyatta dies in '77, Daniel T. Arap Moi comes in. And he's in power for a long time, 20-something years. And unlike Kenyatta, Arap Moi is not a Kikuyu. Instead, he's a Kalenjin. He's from a minority ethnic group in Western Kenya. And he has all the reason in the world not to elevate the importance of Mau Mau within the nationalist narrative, but rather to keep the official silencing in place. Because if he's a Kalenjin and was not part of the independence movement, what does that say about him as the leader of Kenya? So therefore, it wasn't until the relatively recent election of Mwai Kibaki. Kibaki's a Kikuyu who comes from a Mau Mau family. He's elected in December of 2002 that we saw for the first time in independent Kenya the lifting on the ban of Mau Mau that had been put in place by the British colonial government in the 1950s. And up until 2 years ago, the imposition of official amnesia from the top pervaded the lives of many Kenyans. You weren't supposed to talk about Mau Mau. It certainly wasn't part of public discourse in the media. There was no memorialization in Kenya, and it certainly was not taught, at least in any extensive way, in schools. And I can certainly tell you from my own experience of research how difficult it was to speak about this period of time and how nervous people were talking about it. I think then Kenya provides a very unique case for students and observers of transitional justice and reconciliation. And when we look at Kenya more than 40 years after the perpetration of massive human rights violations, a flood of questions comes to mind. And here's just a couple of them. How did local communities heal with the imposition of the silencing? What's been the impact of official amnesia both on the local and national levels? And what's the relationship between these two? And what is Kenya faced with today in light of the unveiling of its past? Now, for those of you who are interested in these various topics, there are numerous works you can read about transitional justice. In fact, I could spend the rest of my career trying to keep up with the literature on transitional justice right now. Some of it's scholarly, some of it's political, a lot of it's very polemical. But much of it examines, on a cross-cultural level, the very questions that I put before you. And I think one of the more important works, and certainly one that I find to be terribly insightful, is Martha Minnow's work Between Vengeance and Forgiveness. And she says this. She says, a most appalling goal of the genocides, the massacres, systematic rapes, and tortures has been the destruction of the remembrance of individuals, as well as of their lives and dignity. This is what joins the Holocaust and the Final Solution, the rape of Nanking, the mass killings of Cambodians, the genocide of Armenians during the Turkish Revolution, the massacre of the Igbos in Nigeria, the killings of the Hutus, the Gulag, the torture of the leftists in Chile, the students in Argentina, the victims of apartheid. And I would add, the survivors of the detention camps in Kenya. Now, the problem that arises, or in many ways the series of problems, then becomes in all of these cases is how to treat the continuing presence of perpetrators and bystanders, victims, after the violence has ended. And the common dilemma places the danger of wallowing in the past alongside that of forgetting. And as Minnow and another man by the name of John Elster and very important African intellectual by the name of Wole Soyinka, they've all suggested that these problems can in some ways be broken down into binaries. In other words, too much memory or simply not enough. Too much enshrinement of victimhood or insufficient memorializing of victims and survivors. Too much past or too little acknowledgement of the past staging of the present. And of course, for 40 years or more, Kenya has fallen on the extreme end of one of these spectrums, right? The silence has been what some may call an unacceptable offense, an implication that the perpetrators in fact succeeded, an indictment that the audience of Kenya was simply the incarnation of the silent bystanders complicit with the offensive colonial regime. But at this juncture, now that the silencing is lifted, the question becomes, what is the way forward for Kenya? In an absolutely stunning move, a little over a week ago, the Vice President of Kenya, Moody Awori, demanded that the British government make a formal apology for what he called gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity. He implored the British government to, quote, do the right and honorable thing. Now, the acknowledgement of the crimes committed some 40 years ago is undoubtedly a very critical factor for many of the survivors still living today. Acknowledgement first by their own Kenyan government that the crimes actually happened, the same government that has been silent for so long. And then a move by the same Kenyan government to correct the country's history books, to move towards memorialization, to bring the crimes of the Mau Mau past into the nationalist narrative of the country. And in fact, if I were here, as I was initially, I think, hoping to be here earlier, had I been, I would have been telling you a much different story. That's how much events have been changing in the last several weeks about this very topic within current contemporary politics and political discourse in Kenya. Now, that said, I think there are many factors that still remain outstanding. Now, the first, of course, is a formal recognition by the British that such crimes, in fact, took place. Now, some may say, and I've heard this from a lot of people, that let bygones be bygones. Leave the past in the past. What good could this possibly do? And indeed, in Britain's response to Kenyan government through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office spokesman, the British government said Kenya's focus should be on the future and not on the past. But it's clear from my own work that such acknowledgement does matter, and it matters on both the local and national level. Now, first on the local level, Kikuyu society has been very much fractured for over the last 40 years. Former Mau Mau adherents and loyalists have been tenuously brought together by the Christian churches. But outside of Sunday services, they don't socialize together, they don't intermarry, they don't share beers. They refuse. And the bitterness is palpable throughout the Kikuyu countryside. What then does British apology have to do with this local healing process? And I would suggest that for Kenya to move forward, a full public accounting needs to take place. In fact, President Mwai Kibaki established something just like this to investigate the feasibility of a Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission within Kenya, modeled very much on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And the TJRC, as it's called, would be bifurcated, one looking into human rights violations that occurred after independence, and the other looking into human rights violations that occurred before independence. Now, for such a commission to work, as many of you know, you have to have participation from all sides, including the British, former loyalists, Mau Mau, and bystanders. And this is where the issue of British acknowledgement and willingness to participate fits in. And of course, a Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission would not just be about healing at the local level, but at the national level as well. I would very much suggest that there's been a culture of impunity that has raged through Kenya beginning in the colonial period that's continued right down to the present day. Institutions and laws that permit detention without trial, the use of torture, the suspension of due process, the confiscation of property, all of these were created by the British colonial government during the 1950s and were carried over almost in toto into the independent regimes and are still there right up to the present day. The use of violence to suppress dissent and the silence that has surrounded and implicitly endorsed it for so long became an acceptable practice some 40 years ago and still to varying degrees, again, continues to this day. Now, by no means am I suggesting that all of Kenya's ills, poverty, corruption, violence, the list goes on, Kenyans are sitting in the front row. In no way am I suggesting that these are entirely due to the country's colonial past. I am suggesting, though, that for social scientists and politicians, and most importantly for Kenyans, to understand current Kenyan society, both at the level of local communal relations and nationalist politics, the past must be examined closely, and a reconciliation must be made with events that occurred over 40 years ago, and that a serious re-examination needs to be made of the institutions and laws and individuals that have been carried over into the independent regimes and that have helped to perpetuate this culture of violence and impunity. This then, in my remaining time, brings me to one last closely related issue, and that is reparations. When assessing the success and failures of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Wole Soyinka suggested that what was missing was both a moral and a material link. And by moral link, he meant that individuals in South Africa were only required to give the Commission a full accounting of their crimes. They weren't required, ever, to utter the words, "I'm sorry." This, according to Soyinka, has been a significant impediment in the process of healing and reconciliation in South Africa. And there is, I believe, something to Soyinka's moral link. In Kenya, scores of survivors who I interviewed over the years echoed the words of Wanjiko Warimu, a woman who I interviewed and who spent nearly 8 years in detention. And she said to me, "I want the British and their loyalists to admit what they did to me and the others. I want them to be good Christians and apologize for what they did and to atone for their sins." And this then brings me to my last point, and that is, in Wanjiko's words, atonement, Soyinka's words, material link. In other words, is an official acknowledgement and apology from perpetrators enough? Or must there be some kind of reparation in order to bring about reconciliation? Today, many survivors in Kenya do indeed believe reparations are a necessary part of the reconciliation equation, and a civil case is in fact being filed against the British government and running in parallel to the Kenyan government's demand for an official apology. But interestingly, many of the survivors are searching less for individual payouts than they are looking for community compensation. So one survivor recently said, "The British didn't spend a shilling in helping us get our lives back together. After the detention, we lost everything, and our communities were completely shattered. We want them and their former loyalist supporters to acknowledge what they did, to apologize, and to finally make amends by giving money for clinics and schools and the physical and psychological help we have needed for so long." In closing then, one thing is for certain. The way forward in Kenya is complicated and personally implicated with contemporary politics and shameless self-interest. Some in Kenya's younger generation see reparations in particular as a political and economic meal ticket. Others, particularly former loyalists and settlers who after independence profited handsomely from the official silencing, as well as from their economic connections, have absolutely no desire to see any kind of Truth Commission go forward. And of course, the politics of corruption may very well see high-ranking officials in Kenya foregoing a Truth Commission should a large incentive be put in front of them. So too might the Kenyan government back off in their demand for an official apology should the British government be more forthcoming with their foreign aid, or more specifically, with foreign aid that comes with no strings attached. It's therefore, from perhaps your ultimate cynic, easy to be cynical. Cynical of prospects of reconciliation being carried forward on the wings of corrupt and self-interested governments, and by that I mean both the governments of Kenya as well as in Britain. But it's here that I would urge us to think of reconciliation as a process, often very slow, but nonetheless one where one step begets another. And it's here that I would suggest we reflect upon the points made by Martha Minow, points that I raised earlier. That a most appalling goal of the genocides, the massacres, systematic rapes, and tortures has been the destruction of the remembrance of individuals, as well as of their lives and their dignity. In Kenya today, the first crucial steps have, in fact, been taken nearly 50 years after the start of Mau Mau and the mass unleashing of destruction upon the Kikuyu people, a process of reversing the remembrance destruction. The silencing has ended, and Kenya's public has begun to acknowledge the individuals who lost their lives and their dignity. And as way of illustration, and of finishing my talk this evening, I'd like to take you back with me to Kenya's central province of 2 years ago. And while there, if you were to ask former Mau Mau adherents if they got along with their loyalist neighbors, the response was generally the same as Miriam Bote's. And she said, we are Christians. I do not hate them. When I probed a little bit further, she expressed a sentiment shared by many of the other former villagers and detainees. I hate those loyalists. I hate them for what they did to us, she said. We all hate them, and we will not speak to them if we see them outside of church. We even refuse to go to their funerals, which is against the church, because they didn't go to the funerals of our husbands and children and parents when they killed them. I despise them. She then paused before continuing. You know, she finally said to me, this will only change when everyone knows what's happened to us. Maybe then there will be some peace once our people are able to mourn in public. And our children and our grandchildren will know how hard we fought and how much we lost to make Kenya free for them. And indeed, I saw Mary, in fact, just a few weeks ago when I was in Kenya. And I asked her what she thought of the Kenyan government's acknowledgement of the past. And she smiled at me. And she told me peace was coming. But then she reminded me, in her own words, and the gentleman in the front will understand, haraka, haraka, haina baraka. To hurry will bring no blessing, she told me. Thank you.
You've been listening to Associate Professor of African Studies, Carolyn Elkins, presenting the lecture, Colonial War Crimes in Kenya, Prospects for Reconciliation. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer segment from this presentation. Carolyn Elkins was awarded the 2006 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction for her first book, Imperial Reckoning, The Untold Story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya. With Susan Peterson, she is co-author of Settler Colonialism in the 20th Century, Projects, Practices, and Legacies. And now we return to the question and answer segment from this program.
Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions, if you have any. Yes?
I just want to make 2 or 3 observations. And your study illustrates very well what I'm going to comment about. When we hear about what has happened in Iraq, and of course the British are there, and then we hear that what has happened in terms of the abuse of the prisoners as an aberration of a few individuals, it's hard to believe that when you see or you look at your historical research that shows a clear pattern that has happened historically, that these are the same people who would say the government policy is quiet and yet they want to blame a few people within the military that are supposedly doing these things independently of any government acceptance. Secondly, when you look at what is happening in Zimbabwe, I'm sure the Western media has been very critical of Mugabe in what he has done in terms of the land issue. When you look at Zimbabwe and Kenya, the 2 countries are historically linked. And when you imagine the situation where in Kenya, after independence, the settlers, most of them retained the very land that historically the people fought for. Up to today, you mentioned in Ivanja where we still have the settler population. And yet, when you look at what Zimbabwe has been trying to do, I'm not apologetic for what Mugabe has done in his own different ways, but when you look at the historical perspective of why things are the way they are in Zimbabwe, I think you can understand where they're coming from in terms of having been moved away from their lands to be settled by foreigners, and yet, after independence, the same pattern continues. What I like your study about is it brings in some authenticity. You manage to open doors that many African scholars would not be believed if they were the ones who had done this research and went about coming up with this information saying, this is what you did to our population. It's surprising that it has taken somebody from the US, a white lady, to write the history that is believable, and yet the idea of reparations, most Africans, most Kenyans have been saying this over and over and over. But I agree with the assessment that the fact that after independence, the loyalists benefited from the independence movement because they happened to get the positions of authority, and those who fought the war were left out. And so the loyalists were happy to keep the status quo rather than try to create a situation where those who fought the war would come back and haunt us. So I think your study has done a lot of good, and I'm surprised that the Vice President, probably after listening to you speak in Kenya and reading your material, has got a voice now to tell the British that we need an apology. Very surprising.
Well, in fact, yeah, I was a little stunned because he actually used I was just in Kenya for the launch of my book, and he was there launching it, and it was at the launch that he used that as a platform for doing it, and I was standing next to him and practically fell over. But I thank you for your comments. I won't respond to any of them. There are more comments, except for the one about the compliment of being a young white American woman, because usually when I'm attacked by the right press in the UK, which I am a lot nowadays, they usually start off with saying, and Professor Elkins is a young American woman, full stop. You know, usually that's the biggest insult in the world, is to call somebody a young American woman. So you don't need to read any further. Yes.
I was just going to ask you, you said things are changing rapidly in the last few weeks, and I apologize for not knowing all this. So what has been happening in the last few weeks that's bringing this to the forefront, changing things?
Yeah, I think some of it is the publication of this book. I think some of it is, frankly, I think some of it's political. For those of you familiar with Kenyan politics, Mr. Edward Clay, who is the High Commissioner in Kenya, made a very dramatic statement about Kenyan corruption, saying that it was like vomit all over his shoes. And that really irritated everybody, including the Vice President. So I think the fact that they are demanding that if the Kenyans want foreign aid from Britain, that they are going to have to follow Britain's rules. And I think that this has greatly irritated the Kenyan government, and now as a way, frankly, politically, of getting back at them. If they want to play this game, then the Kenyan government's very happy. Here, we're going to now ask you for an official apology for war crimes. And I think, therefore, you have to read some of this. One, in the fact that I think that the fact that Mwai Kibaki is a Kikuyu from a Mau Mau family. That's number one. This would never be going on without that. But number two, the fact that the British have been giving the Kenyan government a hard time lately. Some of it justifiable, frankly, some of it not. And this is called playing hardball in politics. Yeah. Yes.
I think we can still see this sort of game of settlers, loyalists, prison tortures going on to this very day in the 6 occupied counties of Ireland. The British government telling outrageous accusations about a bank robbery in Belfast, producing no evidence at all, but everybody's pointing their finger at Sinn Féin, who dumped the peace process. It's the propaganda machine is still at work. Right? Just yesterday.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, and I think one, so often in history we're divided by the areas in which we study. But, for example, myself being an Africanist, but to really understand the nature of counterinsurgency, I think one has to engage in what's now labeled as transnational history, or going history across borders, because the nature of British counterinsurgency policy actually moves from Palestine to Malaya, Malaya to Kenya, Kenya to Cyprus, Cyprus to Northern Ireland. And they move both policies and personnel around the empire, gaining in knowledge and expertise as they go along. So I'm actually finding comments like yours particularly significant when thinking about the nature of counterinsurgency. And as an Africanist, how much does this have to do with issues like race, and how much does it have to do more with the nature of British counterinsurgency more broadly? So, yes?
Yeah, I think I'm going to comment as a historian. I'm a professor and I research South America, and if I want to, I can read all the things that you mentioned about. And I was almost physically pained by how you opened the reading pepper and vaginas. I haven't been to a talk like that, I think, ever. Took such liberty to just do stuff like that. Very, very shocking. And I feel, as somebody from the United States, and I do think, I encourage you to be a little bit stronger in your advocacy. I do feel that you actually play it both ways. to have an apology is nice and is something symbolic, but the post-traumatic stress continues in those houses. People will drink, the violence is in their brains, and so as somebody who's so protected as you are, and as I am as a white scholar, the better thing to say would be to just outright demand counseling centers and pull the small guns out of that. That would be Can you talk about that, and how do you present yourself when you go to Kenya?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I think I agree with you, first of all, on all that, and I think that I alluded to in the beginning of this talk that topics like this, and in some ways, quite unwittingly on my part, I really did believe I was going to be writing about something different. But it found me, and I found it. And I think that the question becomes, and we're trained as historians, that one must remain impartial and outside of politics and activism and the rest. But I also believe in this instance, and particularly in the case of Kenya, whereby I'm really the only person to have done this research. The government sees me as playing a very important role in sorting out truth, justice, and reconciliation. The attorneys putting forward the reparations case see me as playing a very important role. And to, frankly, many, many Kikuyu, I'm seen, and this is not to sort of elevate myself, but in sort of this kind of heroic status of somebody who has finally gotten their history out. And I very much felt when I did these oral histories, the only thing people asked of me consistently was to make sure the world knew what happened to them. Make sure the silencing was lifted. That's all they asked. And I agree with you. When you go through Central Province, you see severe alcoholism, much more so than you see if you went out to Luoland or you went out to the area of the Kamba south of Nairobi. And my feeling is, and this is just a personal feeling on the reparations side, and that is that just that, more clinics, more responses to post-traumatic stress, these kinds of things. And in fact, we're doing work outside of the reparation, outside of the politics, with a lot of NGOs actually right now to get some funding. And we're pretty far along on that actually, and that was part of the reason for this last trip, which my department doesn't know about, but now they do. It's on camera. Yes?
Any of the proceeds from the book contributing towards that process?
They're going, in fact, what happened was the book, they're going more toward the historical side. I formed a Kenyan Oral History Center we've been talking about with Linda and some others, and looking very much toward preserving the life histories of men and women who lived through this period for Kenyans. Because much of the research that we do as academics, quite sadly, is we go in and we do our research and we go away. And we don't bring our books back, we don't bring our research back. And in fact, when I was back in Kenya, part of my work was going back to many of the people that I interviewed and giving them books. And this one man got up and gave this long soliloquy about the fact that you're the fourth researcher who's come through here and you're the only person who's ever come back. But so part of my money is going toward that, toward this oral record center. Yes?
I have a question about that. Some scholars have called him an opportunist.
I'm sorry, some scholars have called him an apologist.
And then he was detained for freedom. How do you relate those two?
Right.
He lived in the UK for 15 years.
Right.
Came to Bogota.
Right.
Got detained.
Yeah, the question is, how do you reconcile Kenyatta in all of this? Some see him as an apologist, and then, of course, he is detained. He spent many years, almost 15 years prior to his detention, living in Britain. He had a British wife. I think the way one explains this is that, in fact, the British really got him wrong, that they saw him as a radical. They saw him as I pointed out, the mastermind of Mau Mau. And, in fact, all he wanted all along was part of the action. And frankly, therefore, it's not surprising. And he comes out of a very conservative, moderate Christian background. He was trained, he was raised in a missionary education. So therefore, when people say, people like Nelson Mandela come out of detention and people can't understand how they say forgive and forget. Well, Kenyatta, number one, comes out of the same kind of Christian background, that very strong one, that Mandela comes out of. But I think secondly and more importantly, Kenyatta was always very moderate, bordering on conservative in his politics. And that plays out, and if you see him as that, then his behavior post-independence makes a lot of sense. His conciliatory gestures toward the settlers, and then of course he becomes incredibly corrupt and is working hand in glove. And another topic for another lecture, all about the Cold War and how Kenyatta becomes extremely instrumental in all of this, and as many African leaders do, and how they are able to use this for their own personal gain. Because these African nations are being divided between East and West. Yeah. Yes?
I have heard some many theories, like talking about, like, you know, what was like the main reason why the British, you know, kind of withdrew. According to your analysis, some people, you know, some school of thought have kind of said it's like the Americans. Influence, you know, the Americans had some influence on the whole thing, and they kind of pushed the British. You guys, you see, you're doing something wrong. How can you connect the American society with this movement here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was some American influence under the, particularly under the Kennedy government, but frankly, it wasn't that strong. You know, I think there was an anti-imperialist mentality, but if it made sense geopolitically for the British to maintain interest somewhere, and Kenya was certainly one of those places, then they did not want the British getting out of Kenya before they stabilized the country and had a very favorable post-colonial government. And in that sense, you see the Americans turning the other way during this. And also, of course, they don't at this point want the British to be accused of being like the Soviets. So nobody in the West is going to blow the whistle on the British. And also, they're deeply concerned about where Kenya is going to head in the Cold War future. And on the one hand, you could argue that, well, then, so therefore don't make this a seedbed for socialism and communism by continuing with colonialism. But that was less the mentality. The mentality was more only we can put in place the moderate African pro-West people, and therefore we have to manage this exit. And that was a lot of what was going on at that point. Yes?
I wondered, when you were doing your research, did you get a feeling of the generation that was born after independence, where they are as far as this information is concerned? I was born 6 months just before independence, and my parents and my grandparents were squatters right about here. And all my life, I've had this joy, you know, about how history was different. Somehow we've been separated from that. And, you know, I'd say at least 99% of the information about Chile is usually
Yeah, it's a really interesting comment, and it's certainly, I think your situation was not unlike the situation of many young people, not just of your generation, but even a bit older, who were born perhaps, you know, even sort of later on in the emergency where they don't really have many memories of this. But for many children and grandchildren, when I interviewed their parents or grandparents, it was the first time they knew they'd been detained. Never knew it. And always knew there was a reason why they couldn't play with those next door neighbors who were loyalists. Always knew there was a reason why, you know, they weren't allowed to have a beer with the people up the ridge, but didn't know exactly why. And I think in that sense too, the sense of antipathy for some, and I don't know what it was in your case, but for some, at least in particularly in Neri and Marenga, less so in Kiambu, was very much there. And there was a lot of course, rumor going around about what had gone on. But yes, I mean, I think that this book certainly opens up a kettle of fish. And, you know, there are a lot of people who are still embittered over the loss of land, embittered by this, and younger generation who feel as though they have no land because their land was confiscated during Mau Mau and they want it back. And that's a big problem, in part because the land registries are a disaster. You ever try to go in there and try to hunt down a deed for land and forget it. But also because some of this land was redistributed, and it was not redistributed to the ordinary Wananchi, it was redistributed to the loyalists and to European settlers. So, getting back to the issue of Zimbabwe, there's a lot of things that the Kenyan government's going to face, and I'm not certain the current Kenyan government, frankly, is quite aware of everything that's going to come out of this. So.
Thank you so much, because it's profound and it's definitely giving us back our history, and I just really want to honor you for this work. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming in. Now, Asante Sana.
You've been listening to Associate Professor of African Studies Carolyn Elkins, presenting the lecture, Colonial War Crimes in Kenya, Prospects for Reconciliation. This program was produced by PDxJustice Media Productions. To find out more about Carolyn Elkins and her work, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to our speaker's Harvard University faculty website, as well as other programs featuring speakers such as Susan Faludi, Paul Krugman, Naomi Klein, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.